In January 2024, Blue Archive held their 3rd anniversary at Makuhari Messe. It was an event meant to celebrate 3 thankful years of a game that started small but grew into something the players and the devs could both be proud of. The event had a lot of typical things you would expect from a convention: merch, cosplays, minigames, and some exhibits. Among these exhibits were giant inflatables of almost every boss a player could encounter at the time. People loved these. It was a lot of fun to see the enemies you fought in-game right before you in person. Hieronymus and his cape were really cool. Kesset's enormous halo struck awe. Perodzilla was much beloved, especially by the cosplayers. Every boss at the venue got praise. Except Goz. I cannot forgive Goz. Everyone's detested Goz, the root of all evil. Despite the inflatable itself being just as cool as the other bosses, every post about Goz came with some sort of scathing negative comment. A lot of the posts about the bosses in general were mostly personal posts that didn't get much traction, but the posts with people flipping him off, that got 100,000 views and 3,500 likes. Attendees were even rooting for the other inflatables to help take down Goz. Players hated this guy, and no wonder. There's a lot of things about Goz that makes him such a miserable experience. Things like the crappy camera, the restrictive roster requirements, techniques that you don't want to be doing on a mobile screen, and mechanics that contradict other mechanics and actively make the boss harder if you tried to do them. It was a mess that beginners hated because they couldn't even begin the boss, and veterans hated because playing felt bad. Now, being a live service game, you'd have expected Nexon Games at some point to have tried to address the problems and fix him, but historically, fixing a boss isn't something they do once the boss has been released. Any changes to the raid experience they do make were only applied to higher difficulties as new content, rather as fixes to existing content. This was how Nexon Games operated for 4.5 years, and players had little hope that this would ever change. But on July 2025, Nexon Games did something unprecedented. They reworked all difficulties of a boss so that everyone could experience a new fight. But did it really address the boss's issues and make the encounter more enjoyable? That's what I'm going to explore in this video, and I hope you'll stick around to listen to me talk about some of the boss design in Blue Archive.
Everyone's mad. I'm not all there. Myself.
So what exactly was wrong with him? Well, since most of Blue Archive's player base is casual or relatively new, let's start with the things that affect the most people and then work our way down to more niche annoyances. The most widespread issue is that our student roster simply does not support fighting him. At the fundamental level, you must have 2 specific utilities on every team in both phases: a student who provides shields and a student who can reposition other students. However, there are immediate problems for bringing dedicated students for these roles. Firstly, you still need slots for your tank, at least 1 DPS, and enough buffs for that DPS. Bringing individual shield and repo students feels really bad. It's difficult to fit them onto the team without compromising the comp in some way. 2 extra skills in your skill rotation also make the fight really heavy and slow. You'll find yourself more often reacting defensively than actually doing any damage. Also, the vast majority of casuals or beginners won't have these students, and typical recommendations and guides advise against even raising them. Mind you, they're not bad students, but as a casual or beginner, you have far more important priorities than raising what is frankly a suboptimal solution to one of 12 bosses in the game. So what is recommended is instead using students that combine shield and repos, which is still not really doable for most people. There are only 5 shield repo students in the game at the making of this video. 2 of them are free, but they have limitations that make them frustrating to use because they were designed and released before gods existed. So realistically, most players are limited to using the few remaining gacha locked students. But this also has its share of issues. Obviously, gacha characters are gacha. One of them is even limited, so the probability of you spooking 2 of over 200 characters are not great. You could pull for them when the radar comes around, but there are so many competitive characters vying for your wallet, allocating the budget for them is difficult to say the least. There is supposed to be a lifeline. We can borrow students from other players and use them in our teams. However, the problem with borrowing utility means you're not borrowing DPS, and for many players, borrowing another person's fully maxed DPS gives you much more mileage than borrowing utility and using your own DPS. But if you don't have the utility, you can't do the raid, so a player is forced to make a decision here. Brute force the boss with pure damage and no shield repos, or have the shield repos and do less damage. Either way, these are poor experiences, and for a casual or newer player, both options are pretty bad. This problem doesn't go away when you are an older player looking to tackle the highest difficulty. Since both phases require shield repos, it means every team you field needs to have one of the 5 possible students. If you had each of them, you could make at most 5 effective teams. However, the highest difficulties are balanced around having multiple teams. This brings us to the next problem. For lower difficulties, you can get away with only having just one of the gacha characters. For the highest difficulties on release, each shield repos you're missing drastically decreases your chances of clearing the boss at all. Of course, being a gacha game, it shouldn't be too surprising that keeping up with the hardest and most recent content requires you to pull, but it's really only Gods that is this strict with its mechanics. Every other boss has readily accessible characters to at least get your foot in the door. Gods doesn't really have that decency. To take it further, this is only talking about the game state now. Back then, Gods released with only 3 shield repos students. Shakyuka, a limited gacha character, Sunsu Shizuko, a limited 1-star, and Kotori, a regular 1-star. Kotori, especially for casuals and beginners, is basically unusable for Gods, so our only valid options are the 2 limited characters. But obviously, because they're both limited, anyone who wasn't around to get them literally could not play the raid. They reran Gods 2 times before they reran either of these limited characters. And because shield repos is an extremely strong, almost game-breaking utility outside of Gods, they couldn't release any new shield repos characters during this time. So every player who joined in this time period got the worst experience possible. By the way, this time period is the same period where Blue Archive's popularity had reached new peaks, bringing in tons of players to a growing cultural phenomenon. Being greeted by Gods was definitely a cold bucket on that experience, and certainly contributed to the resentment leading up to the 3rd Fest in 2024. So that was just the roster issues. Now we have to address how the raid actually plays. Phase 1 is fine. It has flaws like the rabbit AoE attacks being completely random, so sometimes your team would full wipe in the first 20 seconds, but sometimes they'll take absolutely no damage. Repositioning out of the train can also be a bit annoying when your students decide to walk back onto the tracks. Both of these things kinda suck, but for the most part they are tolerable because there are viable decisions you can make to help mitigate these headaches. What Phase 1 definitely does well is establish a rhythm and have you dance along. And once you figure it all out, cycling between moving your students out of the way, killing the mobs, and then pushing for DPS, it can be quite the satisfying dance. So the flaws are certainly unfun, but at the very least it comes together pretty well with the right tools in your kit. What wasn't fun to play, even if you had the best students and the proper setups, was Phase 2. One of the recommended requirements for Phase 2 is to have Focus Fire. Focus Fire lets your team ignore Gods' clones and attack the real one. Unfortunately, we realistically only have 3 valid Focus Fire students. They are either limited or gacha only. So, just like shield repos, there is a pretty difficult team building limitations most players will face. But there are 2 upsides. First is you only need Focus Fire in Phase 2, so you're not spread thin on resources trying to plan out the entirety of Gods' HP bar around less than a handful of viable students. Secondly, you don't have to have Focus Fire because your students will naturally attack the closest enemy to them. Since reposition is already in your kit, all you need to do is pull them close enough to the boss so that they can attack him. This brings us to the biggest problem that was apparent in Phase 1 but is much more obvious and frustrating in Phase 2. Repositioning is hard. There's a lot of reasons for this. The obvious one is that to the uninitiated, repositioning is completely unpredictable and feels like it doesn't work. The expectation for repositions is you click on a spot away from the giant red indicator and your team will go to that spot away from the giant red indicator. In reality, that does indeed happen. You click on the spot and your team goes there. But what players don't expect is your students running a marathon to the other side of the screen or back into the giant red indicator you were just trying to avoid. There's no feedback to the player on what went wrong, and given the fact that our controls are limited to 3 buttons on the screen, the typical player is going to be confused and frustrated. It's worth saying that positions and repositioning is technically deterministic, but the variables you need to account for to have it fully under your control require intermediate to advanced game knowledge and precision over where and when you click. Both of these things the average player is not going to have. Casuals and beginners, by their nature of being casuals and beginners, don't have intermediate to advanced game knowledge. And let's be real, most gacha gamers don't want to learn anyway. Also, as a mobile game, most people will be playing on mobile, where controls are the opposite of precise. Fuck! As a result, the main mechanic of this boss fight is not only difficult to access, but even if you did have it available, it is a confusing and annoying tool to use. And you have to use it for everything. The boss fight completely depends on it. One of the main attacks in this phase are the hats. Hidden in one of 3 hats is a bomb, and after some shuffling, anything in front of the bomb is stunned and dealt significant damage. The intended solution is to move your team in front of the hats without the bomb, which, as mentioned earlier, is an insufferable experience because repositioning is so difficult. But it's also because the shuffling doesn't even have the decency to be shuffled fairly. The outcomes were weighted to show up on one side more frequently than the other side, varying by difficulty. This means, depending on difficulty, you would rather be hanging far left or far right on the map to increase your chances of already being in the safe spot since you won't need to move. If you do need to move, you better hope you're not crossing to the other end because that's impossible. You can't cross end to end in one jump, so usually what happens there is you die and reset. Even if you could somehow do 2 jumps to the other end, you'll have to go back to your original spot really quickly to get into the safe zone in front of the real gods for the map-wide attack. You simply do not have the time to do that. This was obviously really annoying, so players came up with an alternative solution they found much more reliable. Leave the arena entirely and hide in the very corner of the map. Yes, the best solution to the mechanic is to refuse to engage with the mechanic. But even this solution had difficulties. Firstly, it only worked on the left side of the map because the right side of the map was blocked by UI. You can't click underneath your skill bar, and this fact was so annoying they added a UI feature to swap your skill bar to the other side, which people think was just for gods.
結構右下見たい時あって、ゴズと戦ってると右下みたいな時あるから。
Second, if the real gods was on the right side of the map, you will lose all of your DPS because your students will naturally attack left gods. But hang on, could this be fixed by Focus Fire, the other major utility that is recommended for the fight? No, because if you're on the left and you Focus Fire right gods, your team will walk into certain death trying to get into attack range. This phenomenon, by the way, isn't limited to the Chi solution. A player will encounter it if they were doing the boss as intended. One of the major mechanics of the raid, being an active hindrance to the other major mechanic of the raid, is not a playable experience. All of these elements combined together meant that in order to play this raid as intended, you had to pray everything lined up. The best case scenario was hoping the safe hat shared the same lane as the real gods so that you didn't have to move. The chances of this were really low because not only was the hat RNG unfairly weighted, but clone RNG was actually random. Lining up 2 elements of pure chance just didn't happen. Although we play a gacha game, praying for a better outcome in what is basically a strategy game is not good gameplay. There are a few other minor gripes, like how when gods first released, your students naturally gravitated rightwards, making left gods and left safe spots annoyingly difficult to reach. It was also nearly impossible to tell which gods was the real gods on mobile screens because you had to scrutinize the color of the cards gods through. Both of these issues had already been fixed before gods was reworked, but nonetheless they contributed to his infamy. There's also other issues that persisted up until his rework, such as the isometric view, making it unnecessarily difficult to judge distances, and made players very confused when your students attacked the gods that looked further away. It's time to put these to rest though, as the rework for Phase 2 arrived in July 2025 on JP and November the same year for Global. So then, what exactly did they change, and did they really fix him? The most immediately noticeable change is a new camera angle. Instead of the angled isometric view, we now see gods in a straighter head-on view, which makes judging distances much easier. Now, wherever your students stand, it is easier to understand which gods they are going to attack, and trying to figure out the right spot for the repositions is far less demanding. The map dimensions have also changed slightly so that the hats will cover the map from end to end. This means no more chi strategies to avoid the mechanic entirely. By itself, this would have just added to the annoyance of the boss, but they did actually change the behavior of gods and the hats so that you don't need to cheese the attack. The position of the real gods is no longer random and fully scripted. The hat shuffling is also no longer random and fully scripted. Together, they are scripted in such a way that you either don't need to move away from your position, or at most you only need to move one hat over. Unless you are standing in front of the wrong gods in the first place, there will now never be a time where you will run a marathon across the map to the safe spot. This is obviously a much more playable experience than previously. The old design basically guaranteed that a certain proportion of your runs were going to end in failure because you simply had no viable plays to make. It punished your audacity to even attempt the boss. The new design only punishes you if you have been standing in front of the wrong gods. This is something you're not likely to get wrong anymore, and you should be doing it anyway because it contributes to your DPS. It's worth mentioning that the possible behavior of your students running back into danger didn't change, but that's something that likely can't be fixed unless they completely overhauled fundamental systems driving BA from the ground up. Expecting they do that is, I think, a little unreasonable. Also, the changes have mitigated this issue by requiring less movement, and new zones are generous enough that it can afford a little bit of deviancy from the students. The issue technically persists, but it's going to be bothering a lot less players from now on. Taking it all in, the head-on camera angle, the change in map dimensions, and the scripted gods and hat positions all contribute to combining what was previously individual mechanics with no synergies and no cohesive design principles into one unified experience. The player, very importantly, now has control over the gameplay. Any failures now are more easily diagnosable and attributable to player decisions instead of blaming gods for being a mean asshole. In terms of what happens in-game, gods is a much more playable raid. But in my opinion, that's all it really is. We upgraded from an insufferable raid with unreasonable failure states to a raid that is playable because it is now fully scripted from beginning to end. From what I gather on social media and discussions, players certainly don't hate this boss anymore, but it doesn't seem to be any more interesting than it was. In fact, it might even be less interesting. Making the hat safe spot always on the real gods or right next to it is a good change, but locking the real gods in scripted positions to achieve that feels like we've gone 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Now, instead of reacting and engaging with the enemy for a unique experience, we are now prescribed the same experience over and over and over again. And this is probably an odd complaint because every other boss in the game is also scripted. But every other boss in the game has a rhythm. There's a push and a pull. There are choices to make with unique rewards to add depth. So even if it is scripted, you're putting in effort to write details into the script so that it remains interesting to you. Here's an example. The cartridges are a scripted fight. In any attempt, they will always use their skills at fixed times. So when a ranger begins to activate their skill, there's a choice. Do I cancel it or do I let it happen? Can I afford to let it happen? If Red Ranger gets a taunt, then I can't use any more striker skills and I have an important DPS skill I need to use on a skill bar. Oh, but wait, if I use CC, now there's a risk that Yellow Ranger does lethal damage to my tank later. Maybe I should save my CC for Yellow instead. But what if I brought 2 CC characters? But 2 CC characters make my rotation heavier and slower. But maybe that's worth it, because by locking the ranges more, I might have more freedom to do more damage. Yeah, but why don't I just try CC in Red for now? It's scripted, so if it doesn't work this time, I can make a different decision next time. Maybe even change my team, and lock it in if it's better. The original decision was very simple, but there's a lot of extended nuance and depth behind that decision. And then, through that nuance, you have the agency to create a solution from beginning to end that is satisfactory. Gods doesn't have any of that. The way it remained vaguely interesting before was actually through its randomness. This is why, despite it being the most hated boss in the game, it still had an odd number of people who really liked it, myself included. But now, every choice has been made for you. First Gods is right. Oh, go right, bomb is left, don't need to move, hit the boss. Then he goes to the middle. Sit there, move out of the bomb, move back to the middle, hit the boss. Oh, Gods is left now, safe spot is already there, sit there, hit the boss. There are no choices to make in the game, and critically, gameplay doesn't change when you change your team. But what's really baffling to me is that they actually did do something to address this, but only made it available to Lunatic, which only a very small proportion of players can do. On Lunatic, the safe hats without the bombs can grant you one of 2 buffs. You can get a very strong cost recovery buff that will let you use more skills and churn through your rotation. Or you can get a very strong damage buff that will dramatically increase your output for a short time. The buff you get depends on whether the player decides to go to the hat with the yellow coin or the blue coin. It's not perfect because in some parts of the timeline, one of the coins will be on the opposite side of the map, so you'll suffer the issues of the original raid design. But for the most part, this is a very good mechanic. It engages the player into making a dynamic decision which changes the outcome of the raid. And just as importantly, you might make a different decision depending on your team composition. This mechanic has made Lunatic a very engaging raid with more layers of meaningful decisions, and I think this should be on all difficulties. My guess on why they didn't introduce it to all difficulties is probably because they didn't want to rebalance Gods' HP to compensate for the increased damage. I don't think this is a very good reason though, since reworking a boss will be the perfect time to rebalance their HP. And by the way, that was only about how Phase 2 now plays. The biggest barrier of entry to the boss is still unresolved. You need shield repods for both phases. They are still one of the rarest utilities in the game, they are still one of the strongest utilities in the game, so it's not a good idea to release more, and all the alternatives still suck. For this to really be fixed, they'll need to reduce how much shield repods we need. This would involve a rework to Phase 1. I have some opinions on how they could rework Phase 1 without changing the themes of the trains driving by to drop off a gang of mobs, but doing so is probably going to add another 10 minutes to this already long video. So instead I'm going to open this up for discussion. What do you think they could do to ease roster requirements while keeping the train and the mobs? I'd love to see your ideas in the comments. And so we finally touched on all of the important things that changed and didn't change. Considering all of this information, did the rework fix GOS? Yeah, I think it did. Despite my complaints of its shortcomings, if the goal was to turn what is an extremely hated boss into something that isn't having your players flip it off at your major yearly celebration, then that goal was achieved. The roster issues remain, and it's kind of bad, but at least you're no longer forced to reset when the hats wipe the entire team on a whim. Besides, it's not only the fact that GOS is playable, it's the whole idea that Nexon Games is finally willing to rework content that players hate doing. For 3 years, across 7 reruns, people ragged on this guy every single time. Should we hold Nexon Games to higher standards and continue to complain about how it's nearly impossible for a new player to make a team for this boss? Yeah, we should. But I think we should also appreciate that these are very critical first steps into a practice that, honestly, very few developers in the industry even think about doing. Reworking and rebalancing all the content to keep them relevant and enjoyable for players of all levels is to be celebrated. Well, that concludes this video. I'm going to let you guys in on a little secret. This script has been 1.5 years in the making, maybe more. It took so long that there's now a new most hated boss in the game. And the reason it took so long wasn't just procrastination, but I was facing a dilemma I didn't know how to address. My original script was honestly twice as long as this version. Much of it was spent explaining each of GOS's mechanics and diving deep into game mechanics. At the time, I felt it was necessary to explain game mechanics to explore why GOS sucked. Although I don't doubt game knowledge is interesting, doing it that way felt unfocused. It meandered around and it was just way too long. So not knowing what to do, the script just sat there in purgatory for 1.5 years. Honestly, I thought it was going to disappear forever. But Nexon Games threw me a bone, and holy shit, they reworked something. With this in mind, I was able to write something that focused on only the problems and the changes, and finally, here it is. Hopefully with this video done, we may have opened the gates to exploring other ideas I've been stewing for a little too long. Maybe I'll finally make a part 2 to that gacha vid I did over a year ago. Oh well, let's worry about that later. Whether you liked or hated GOS, enjoyed the new version or find him boring, whether you would show him the bird if given the opportunity or cheer for his downfall, I wish you, in whatever you do, good luck and to have fun. Ran out of battery, oh no.